Welcome to the latest MS Hear from the Experts webinar. This webinar series is helping people better understand multiple sclerosis, highlights MS-related resources, plus provides tools and tips to navigate their MS journey with more knowledge and confidence. Our intention is to help learn more about this disease, treatments, research, wellness strategies, our programs, and much more. So thank you for joining us for this evening's broadcast. I'm Shauna McKinnon. I'm your moderator for today's broadcast. I've been a volunteer with MS Canada and before that MS Society of Canada since 1998. So I just marked my 27th anniversary with multiple sclerosis. MS Canada would like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded and ancestral territory of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people across Canada. These nations have cared for this land from the ocean to the mountain peaks for thousands of years and continue to do so today. We thank them for their continuous care and for the opportunity to host this session today. At MS Canada, we are committed to learning from and working with Indigenous peoples to care for the land we all call home. Before we get started with our presentation, let's briefly go over a couple of housekeeping items. Your microphones have been muted. If you have a question, you can type it into the chat box and we will try to get to as many questions as possible following the presentation. Please note that questions pertaining to specific personal situations likely cannot be answered in this type of venue, and we recommend contacting your personal MS healthcare team or perhaps contacting the MS Knowledge Network for those questions. The session is being recorded and will be available soon on our website in English under Informative Videos on MS, formerly called Archived Webinars, and on our YouTube channel. A Facebook Live recording will be available as well. Also, please note that MS Canada does not approve, endorse, or recommend any specific product, therapy, or service, but instead provides information to assist individuals in making their own health and wellness decisions. The views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and may not necessarily reflect the views or positions of MS Canada. Since 1948, we at MS Canada have been proud to be a part of the community of people living with MS, their families, friends, plus volunteers, donors, researchers, clinicians, and many more. Together, we have helped fund research, provide information, and support to people affected by MS, and we've taken a bold stance to advocate for changes that allow people living with MS to live full and inclusive lives. Our current strategic plan not only lays out the roadmap in our journey to create a world free of MS, but we hope it also provides inspiration for all in the MS community to connect and collaborate, so together we can advance treatment and care, enhance well-being, understand and halt disease progression, and prevent MS from happening. Please note that during this broadcast, a couple of pop-up polls will appear. We ask that you respond to each. The anonymous information will help MS Canada better understand your experience and the impact it is having on the MS community. Your responses will help strengthen our education sessions in the future. Now on to the presentation. When diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, an unpredictable and episodic disease, individuals will experience many changes while learning to adapt to their new reality. Today, you'll learn about adjusting, coping, and life following an MS diagnosis. When people become more resilient, they can experience positive changes in their moods, relationships, and self-confidence, plus they can see more opportunities in life. It's our hope that the material contained in this webinar will help individuals build their resilience and live their best life with MS. Today's expert is Dr. Anthony Feinstein. He's a professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto and runs an MS neuropsychiatry service at the Sunnybrook Health Services Center. Dr. Feinstein's expertise is in the neuropsychiatry of MS, and his research includes testing that includes brain imaging, both structural and functional, plus qualification of mood symptoms. His research has been supported by MS Canada, the Canadian Institute of Health Research, and the Progressive MS Alliance. The MS Canada-funded studies have looked at brain MRI correlation with depression, the development of computerized tests of cognition, imaging changes linked to cannabis use in people with MS, and more recently, looking at cognitive rehabilitation and exercise in people with progressive MS. Please welcome Dr. Feinstein.
Good. Thank you, Shauna. Thank you for that introduction. I'm very happy to be with you tonight. I am giving this presentation from my office, so just a very quick warning. There's environmental friendly lighting in my office, and so when I don't move, sometimes it goes off. I just have to reverse back to get some movement in the room and the lights come back on. So it's not a system failure, it's just something good for the environment. Okay, could I have my first slide, please? So I'm going to speak about acceptance and resilience and many other things in between. Next slide, please. Next slide. The following topics will be discussed: stress, resilience, self-efficacy, coping, adjustment, and then some thoughts on depression and anxiety. Next slide, please. So let's start with stress. Next slide. So you know, as someone living with multiple sclerosis, that this can be a very stressful disease. And managing stress becomes key to your wellness. The next slide, please. I put this quote up from the famous Canadian stress researcher Hans Selye. Man should not try to avoid stress any more than he would shun food, love, or exercise. Don't be afraid to enjoy the stress of a full life, nor so naive to think you can do without some intelligent planning and thinking. Those last points are very crucial to my presentation, some intelligent planning and thinking. Next slide, please. So Selye's work has been well published. He wrote a book with a very catchy title, Stress Without Distress, which I think is really important, and I'm going to try and focus a bit on that over here. And he also wrote his autobiography, The Stress of Life. Next slide, please. So this is an interesting scale, the social readjustment rating scale. And what researchers tried to do was to quantify the stress of life. And I'll give you an example of that. If you give me the next slide. This is very small. I don't know whether you can see it, but if you can't, they rated life stressors according to the severity. So at the top of the pile, you have what is considered the greatest stress, the death of a child, next one, the death of a spouse, etc. As you work your way down this list, you'll see that each stress is given a particular number. The higher the number, the more significant or more severe the stress. Next slide, please. And these life stresses are thought to be cumulative. So, for example, if you accumulate a number of points, for example, if your stress score is lower than 150, you will have a low susceptibility to stress-induced health breakdown. But when your stress scores start going up, for example, if your score falls in the range of 150 to 300 points, you have a 50% chance of a stress-induced health breakdown in the next 2 years. And if your stress count goes beyond 300 points, there's an 80% chance of a stress-induced health breakdown in the next 2 years. So, really good compelling evidence that when stress becomes very high in your life, it can have a negative effect. It is likely to have a negative effect on your health. Next slide, please. And when you see the stresses, I kind of blew up the list of stressors over here. If you go down and see item number 6 on this, the sixth most significant stress is considered a major personal injury or illness. And of course, multiple sclerosis is one of these illnesses. And if you go down a little further to number 11 on this list, this stresses major change in the health or behavior of a family member. So even if you don't have MS, but you have someone in your family who does, that, by extension, can become a significant stress as well. So stress is very much part of illness. And given that multiple sclerosis is a difficult illness to manage, stress is almost ubiquitous in people with this disease. The next slide, please. So I want to be very clear. Stress cannot cause multiple sclerosis. I'll say that again. Stress will not cause multiple sclerosis, but stress can lead to an exacerbation in multiple sclerosis. Next slide, please. And this is a very nice study looking at multiple research protocols investigating this, and you can see all those dots running down this slide. And when those dots are to the left of that vertical line, this basically says the weight of evidence shows that stress can indeed lead to an exacerbation or a worsening in your multiple sclerosis symptoms. So one more compelling reason why you want to learn how to manage stress. The next slide, please. What's going on in your body when you have a lot of stress? Well, the network or the physiology of stress comes from the HPA axis, H for the hypothalamus, P for the pituitary, the HPA axis. And I'll show you a cartoon just now of what this axis looks like. But this axis is thought to modulate the immune system. We know that multiple sclerosis is an immune disorder. And so when you get a dysfunctional HPA axis, this may further compromise your immune response. So let's have a look at that in terms of a graph. Next slide, please. And there we see what the HPA axis looks like. So the hypothalamus is at the lower part of the brain, goes down to the pituitary, which is also the lower part of the brain, and then the networks and the connections are with the adrenal gland in your abdomen, and that produces cortisol, which is your stress hormone. When cortisol levels are high, it's indicative of significant stress, and very high levels of cortisol that don't go down can be injurious to one's physical and emotional health. Next slide, please. Chronic stress has been linked to depression, to anxiety, to digestive problems, headaches, heart disease, weight gain, insomnia, and memory and concentration problems. So the ramifications are widespread and considerable. Next slide, please. So let's move on to resilience. What is resilience? This refers to the process of adapting well in the face of adversity. Adapting well in the face of adversity. And in fact, there is now a multiple sclerosis resilience scale to try and quantify your resilience score. Next slide, please. Now, once again, this might be too small for you to read, but this is the multiple sclerosis resilience scale. And it has questions like, I feel I have control over my life. I believe I can successfully manage my MS. When things go wrong, I figure out a positive way to handle it. Then on the negative side, having MS makes me feel hopeless. Thinking about the future makes me feel depressed. So there's a whole series of questions designed to detect your level of resilience. And once again, your values come with each of these questions. You can come up with a resilience score. And this has been tailored specifically for people with multiple sclerosis. Obviously, a high, good score, good resilience is something that you want. You want a high score. Next slide, please. You will see some artwork throughout my presentation, and I think this is a very telling graphic of strength, confidence, balance, energy, endurance, etc. within a balloon, and that can be pricked very easily by multiple sclerosis. And so you really have to work on your resilience and your endurance and pay attention to all the things that are captured in this balloon: finances, sociability, marriage, relationships, etc. And we'll speak a bit more about that. The next slide, please. I want to speak now about self-efficacy, which is somewhat different from resilience, but allied to it. So self-efficacy refers to a person's belief in his or her ability to carry out behaviors that are required to reach specific goals. It's indicative of an individual's confidence in being able to exert a degree of control over his or her behavior and social milieu. The importance of this concept in adapting to disabling conditions such as MS is indicated by the availability of 4 different validated MS-specific self-efficacy scales. So earlier I showed you a scale for resilience. In fact, when it comes to self-efficacy, there are 4 different self-efficacy scales, which I think reflects the degree to which we regard this as such an important aspect of coping with multiple sclerosis. So greater self-efficacy, we know, is associated with less loneliness, a better quality of life, and improved physical, cognitive, and social functioning. Next slide, please. And once again, just to make the point, MS can come with a very considerable burden. And when you're resilient and you've got self-efficacy, you can master that burden. You can overcome this. Next slide, please. Let's move on to coping. So the MS literature, like the literature for many other significant illnesses, tells us that there are good coping strategies and poor strategies. Avoidance is a very poor coping strategy. If you've got a problem in front of you, you do not want to avoid it. It will not go away. Generally, it gets worse with avoidance. The best coping strategy is problem-focused. You identify what the problem is, and then you try and work out a solution to deal with it. Emotion-based coping, which is a third coping strategy, has both pros and cons. Sometimes it can be helpful to vent emotionally in response to a difficulty, but you don't want emotional venting to be your only response to a problem. If that's going to be your sole coping strategy, you will have a problem with it. That's why I've written their pros and cons. So a little bit of emotional venting from time to time in a limited fashion might be helpful to how you feel emotionally, but the best coping strategy is problem-focused. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yep. So here are common problems. If you've got fatigue, and this is very common, as you know, in people with MS, you can feel slowed down, your brain can feel sluggish. Next slide, please. There may be difficulty with movement and sensation because of spinal cord problems. Next slide, please. You may have cognitive dysfunction in which it seems like your brain has become a maze and you can't navigate your way through it. Next slide, please. There can be things like job loss and unemployment, which can be so distressing. So I give you 4 common typical difficulties that I see every day in my MS clinic. You want to have coping strategies for each of these. For example, if there's fatigue, you don't want avoidance. You don't want to step back from life in the face of your fatigue. You want to come up with a plan, with a potential antidote to your fatigue. How do I manage my fatigue? What medications might help me? What kind of psychological strategies can I bring in to manage fatigue? Can I speak to my work about getting accommodations with having, micro breaks during the day? Can I get an accommodation that allows me to work from home so I don't have to make a long, tiring commute? And so you can see how I'm thinking. You're trying to come up with your strategies and solutions, your problem-focused approach to dealing with a particular difficulty. That's the way you get on top of a particular problem, not by avoidance and not by pure emotion-based coping. The next slide, please. So what happens when stress overwhelms you, or self-efficacy falters, or resilience is limited, or your coping is dysfunctional, or there are combinations of all of this? Well, I see this often in my clinic. Individuals who have these difficulties can show up with an adjustment disorder, with symptoms of depression or anxiety or mixed depression and anxiety. In other words, you are struggling to adapt or adjust to the ramifications and the difficulties that come with multiple sclerosis. Next slide, please. So when you have a look at emotional difficulties, I've created what I call an inverted hierarchy. When someone gets the diagnosis of MS or they struggle with MS, it's most common for me to see transient distress. It's, of course, upsetting to get the diagnosis of MS. It can be a shock, One night you go to bed and you find the next morning you wake up and you're blind in your left eye. That's an enormous stress on you. That's very distressing. But I'm pleased to report that the majority of people will experience transient distress. In other words, the distress is there for a period, for days, for weeks, maybe a couple of months, but then it can resolve as they get on with their life and coping mechanisms, self-resilience, self-efficacy kick in. If it doesn't, and we move down the triangle, we have these adjustment disorders. These are individuals who are struggling to adjust to the disease or their symptoms. And this adjustment can show up as symptoms of anxiety or depression. And the therapy would focus on helping the individual adjust better to the illness and to come up with good coping strategies for their symptoms. And then at the bottom of this inverted triangle, you've got actual psychiatric disorders, or full-blown mental health difficulties. The next slide, please. So looking beyond adjustment disorders to more significant psychiatric disorders, what are these disorders? Next slide. Let's start off with depression. And once again, the print is probably going to be small on your screen, but I give you 2 studies over here. The one on the left in blue comes from 2 databases, one in the United States combined with one in the United Kingdom, from a registry in the United Kingdom and from Department of Defense data in the United States. And this shows very clearly that the rates of depression in people with multiple sclerosis are 2 to 3 times what they are in the general population. So depression is common in people with MS. And indeed, over the course of a person's lifetime with multiple sclerosis, the rates of clinically significant depression can be as high as 50%. In other words, 1 in 2 people with MS can anticipate developing a clinically significant depression over the course of their lifetime. The study in green on the right side of the screen are Canadian data from out west from 4 Canadian provinces, 44,000 people with multiple sclerosis, so a very robust, strong sample, compared to over 220,000 people without multiple sclerosis, matched to the people with MS in terms of age and sex and geographical location. And what this data showed is that depression is more common than anxiety, is more common than bipolar disorder, is more common than schizophrenia-type reactions, but all four of these conditions, their rates are elevated in people with multiple sclerosis. But the most common is depression, and the second most common is anxiety. Next slide, please. So, what are the consequences of having depression? And once again, there's a lot of text on this. Don't worry about reading every word. My screen is very small. You probably can't see every word. But we know that depression is a robust predictor of quality of life. When you are depressed, your quality of life goes down. Study after study has indicated this. And indeed, this is not just data that's unique to Canada or the United States or the Western world. The study that I put a blue box around at the bottom is a global review of quality of life. 54 studies from the Americas, from Europe, from Asia revealed a consistent picture. As depression increases, the quality of life goes down. The next slide, please. Let's speak a little bit about anxiety. Anxiety is not quite as common as depression, but the rates are elevated. And this is a review article. This is a systematic review and meta-analysis. What a meta-analysis means, you take the data from multiple studies and you pool them and you derive conclusions from that. These were 32 studies, showed that around about 36% of people with multiple sclerosis were anxious. Once again, significantly above what you see in the general population. Anxiety appears to be more common in women than in men. You do find anxiety together with depression, so it's not an and/or phenomenon. And it's also linked to a past psychiatric history, a history of mental health difficulties before the onset of multiple sclerosis. Next slide, please. So let's move on to treatment. Next slide, please. The American Academy of Neurology has stated that cognitive behavior therapy is the best or most robust therapy for treating depression in people with multiple sclerosis. And what you see over there is this book, CBT for Dummies, and the distinguished man in a bow tie is Aaron Beck, the founder of cognitive behavior therapy. And the principle behind cognitive behavior therapy is that people who become depressed have distorted thoughts, negative thoughts. We call them cognitive distortions. They think in a negative way. They anticipate negative things. They view the world in a negative light. And basically the principle behind CBT is that if you can correct these negative thoughts, a person's mood improves. And the data suggests that it does. Next slide, please. These are two very important studies. With the advance in technology, cognitive behavior therapy can now be given online. And in the top study over here, I don't know whether you can see this, there was a study done and published in 2015 showing that internet-based cognitive therapy, in other words, CBT given over the internet to people with MS, could indeed help depression. When you go down the arrow and you look at the study at the bottom over here, the same group repeated the study and published it approximately 8 years later, but they took the cognitive behavior therapy on the internet and they tailored it specifically for people with multiple sclerosis. And what they demonstrated was that the effect size, in other words, the efficacy of the therapy almost doubled. And so you've got an effect size for internet-based cognitive psychotherapy that approaches 1, which is a very robust effect size. In other words, CBT given over the internet with this particular program is an effective way of treating depression in people with multiple sclerosis. And when you look at the graphs, you can see 3 colored lines. There's a red line, there's a green line, and there's a blue line. The individuals in the red and blue groups are the ones who got the internet-based psychotherapy, and you can see how the depression scores drop over 12 weeks, whereas the control group, the blue group, still had significant symptoms of depression. The blue group did not get any intervention. And once again, I apologize for the smallness. I did not know that the numbers would come out so small on the screen. But when you look at the table to the right of the graph, This makes the point that cognitive behavior therapy does not just help mood, it doesn't just help lift depression, but it improves quality of life, it improves people's ability to adapt to multiple sclerosis, and overall has a beneficial effect on how you approach your life in general. So cognitive behavior therapy is effective. Next slide, please. Another good therapy is mindfulness-based therapy, and that gentleman over there is Dr. Kabat-Zinn, the founder of mindfulness-based therapy. And this is a therapy that helps you deal with stress. When people have unpleasant, stressful thoughts and they feel anxious, they want to run away from those thoughts. They tend to try and avoid them or push them aside. Mindfulness therapy teaches you to sit with your thoughts, to master them, to gain mastery of your anxious thoughts. And by doing so, you conquer your anxiety or you conquer your depression. It's a very effective therapy as well. And the data that I've demonstrated in the cartoon shows that, to the left of this line over here, that mindfulness therapy, you see the green circle over here, significantly improves depression, but it also improves fatigue. And over here, it improves quality of life. And then 6 months after the mindfulness therapy has ended, there are still benefits with respect to depression, fatigue, and quality of life. So a very useful therapy in addition to CBT. Next slide, please. There's also acceptance and commitment therapy. It's a type of psychotherapy that helps you move beyond negative thoughts and feelings in a meaningful way by accepting that your thoughts and emotions are an appropriate response to certain situations and committing to making changes in your life that match your values. So once again, it comes with accepting MS as a disease. You can't cure it yet. You should not avoid dealing with your symptoms, but you come up with strategies that help you adapt and cope and master your symptoms. So another useful psychotherapy. Next slide, please. What about medications? Well, I can tell you that people with multiple sclerosis prefer talk therapy, psychotherapy to medications, but there is a place for antidepressant medication for people who are depressed, and there are various useful drugs. Bupropion, also called Wellbutrin, is useful if depression comes with fatigue. Mirtazapine, also called Remeron, is useful if your depression comes with insomnia or if you have some nausea in response to taking other antidepressant medications. If there's sexual dysfunction and depression and you don't want to worsen the sexual dysfunction, mirtazapine, called Remeron, or bupropion, called Wellbutrin, would be your drugs of choice. If you've got depression and prominent pain, duloxetine or possibly venlafaxine would be helpful. If you have urinary symptoms, duloxetine might be helpful when you're managing your depression. And if you miss doses because there are cognitive difficulties, Prozac or fluoxetine is going to be your drug of choice because it's got a long half-life. And so if you miss your nighttime or your daily medication, it's really not that bad because your drug levels don't drop. Next slide, please. So this, I think, is really interesting. I'm getting towards the end of my presentation. Emotions and the immune system. Next slide. We now know that psychological interventions, in other words, psychotherapy, has a beneficial effect on your immune system. And remember that multiple sclerosis is an immune disorder. It's an immune disease. Next slide, please. And here's data from 56 studies showing that in the big oval up here, every one of these studies was associated with psychotherapy having a beneficial effect on people's immune system. Now, this is not data from multiple sclerosis. There are some MS studies embedded in this, but this is in general. That good psychotherapy, in particular cognitive behavior therapy, comes with the added benefit of improving your immune system. So it doesn't just help you with your depression or your anxiety or managing stress, but there are ancillary benefits. Your inflammatory cytokines, your negative, harmful inflammatory cytokines can improve. And your positive aspects to your immune system get boosted by good psychotherapy. Next slide, please. And this is a fascinating study showing that individuals with MS who got stress reduction therapy showed an improvement in their brain MRI. So these were individuals who were stressed. They were randomized to a group that got stress response therapy and a group that got no therapy. The group that got the stress response therapy is in blue. The group in red did not get the therapy. And what you see in the graph over here refers to brain MRI changes. So the group that had the stress response therapy had fewer gadolinium or contrast-enhanced brain lesions, the blue bar over here, and in general they had fewer hyperintense, or those white matter lesions that you see in your brain MRI. The moment the therapy stopped and the individuals felt stressed, the two groups came back together in terms of their MRI changes. And so isn't this fascinating that talk therapy, good talk therapy that reduces your stress, doesn't just make you feel better emotionally, it can have benefits with respect to how your brain MRI looks as well. Next slide, please. So, the importance of good emotional health in people with MS is as follows. It improves your quality of life. It can bolster your immune system, and thereby there can be indirect benefits in treating multiple sclerosis itself. So all significant findings in the lives of people with multiple sclerosis. Life is sweeter when your mental health is good. I want to thank Chris Tachiak, a person with multiple sclerosis, who gave me the artwork for my presentation. Next slide, please. Happy to take questions. Also acknowledge that I'm on staff at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Centre. That's the top picture of Sunnybrook, but I'm also on staff at the Barlow Clinic at St. Michael's Hospital, and I'm part of the University of Toronto Academic Network. If any of you want to read more about this, next slide, one final slide. Oh, should be one more slide. Mind, Mood, and Memory is something that I wrote recently to highlight the silent, invisible symptoms of multiple sclerosis. These difficulties are often missed. Depression and anxiety and fatigue and pain is often overlooked because you can't see it. It's not like someone who has difficulty walking or someone who is blind in one eye. These are the silent symptoms of MS, but as I've shown you in this presentation, they have the most profound effect on the lives of people with multiple sclerosis. Plus, the good news is that these symptoms are, to varying degrees, treatable. And I wanted to take that message away from tonight's presentation. The anxiety, the depression, the distress that people feel in response to multiple sclerosis is treatable. There are good psychotherapies and or some useful medications that can make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Feinstein. Some really interesting stuff from somebody who went through the wildfires in Fort McMurray many years ago. I understand the whole concept of resilience, and I find it really, really interesting. So I have a question about nutrition and exercise, and how can that be a part of making it, helping somebody to cope with this transient stress from a diagnosis of MS, or how can it help improve the resilience?
So great question. I mean, healthy eating is good for everyone, of course, and so you want to eat well. That's very important. It's not just good, for your immune system, but it's good for your cardiovascular system. It's good for brain health. So eating healthily is very, very important. Exercise is fascinating. There are now good studies, and I didn't give you a slide to show this, but there are many studies that show that exercise can indeed help with depression. The effect size is not large, but the trend is in a positive direction. So people who exercise regularly have a better mood. And we know this now. There's also an emerging literature to suggest that exercise can improve your cognition. Now, today's webinar is not focused on cognition. That's a separate topic, and I think it's very clearly a webinar all on its own. But exercise can indeed help cognition. I was fortunate enough to be very generously funded by the Multiple Sclerosis Society of Canada, or MS Canada, recently, when they gave me a very large grant to run an international multi-center study looking at exercise as a treatment for cognitive impairment in people with progressive MS, the more advanced MS, primary and secondary MS. So the individuals in our study, they came from Canada, from the United States, United Kingdom, Belgium, Denmark, and Italy. So a truly international study run from my lab in Toronto. And exercise was one of the components that we used to treat cognitive impairment. And we showed that it makes a difference, that it improves processing speed. That 12 weeks of exercise regime twice a week, aerobic exercise, had a significant benefit for almost 2/3 of our patients when it came to their cognition. So yes, exercise is good in general for you. It's good for your cardiovascular health, good for your brain health, but there's now good data to show it can help with depression. and it can also help with cognitive dysfunction. So exercise.
Excellent.
And sorry,
One other
one final.
question I have.
Sorry, John. Just one final
Oh,
point.
go
So
ahead.
that the study that MS Canada funded were for people that had advanced MS. They had an EDSS, you may be familiar with that, an EDS score of 6.5, which means these were individuals who used ambulatory aids. They were on the cusp of going into a wheelchair. They weren't quite at a wheelchair. If you have an EDS score of 7, that means you could require a wheelchair. But this was a group with a score of 6.5. So the question was, well, how do you exercise when you have advanced physical disability? And we used recumbent bicycles. So this is a safe way of doing it. People are not going to fall off the bike. You settle into a bike, your limbs are strapped in, and you can exercise. Your legs exercise, your upper arms exercise, you get an aerobic regime, you build up a sweat, your heart rate improves, your strength improves, your walking ability improves, and as a very significant corollary, your cognition improves.
Excellent. One question I was wondering particularly is about when does transient stress become an adjustment disorder? How long do you have to be going through this stress or having those symptoms before you are further down the line?
Right. Great question. So, I made the point earlier on that a little bit of stress in our lives is good because it motivates us, it gets us to do something. But what's the threshold at which stress becomes a problem? And I think the markers are very clear. If it starts affecting your life in a negative way, if it leaves you feeling distressed, in other words, when stress becomes distress, then you've got a problem. When it's impeding your ability to function at work, or in your social environment, or both. So the moment you feel that stress is impeding your ability to function, you've got a problem. Sometimes you might not be the best judge of this. Other people might see it in you. Your loved ones, your spouse, close friends might see it and say, you're really stressed lately, and they can pick it up. You might not be in tune with what's going on. That's another useful pointer for you. But mastering stress, I believe, is key to this disease. There's compelling data to show that persistent stress can lead to an exacerbation or a worsening in your MS. And downstream, it does come with anxiety, depression, and other health-related problems. So be aware of it. Be aware that just getting the diagnosis of multiple sclerosis itself is a very significant stress. When I showed you that list of stressors put out by stress researchers, number 6 on the list of the most significant stresses was getting a diagnosis of a major illness, of which multiple sclerosis is one. And so from the very get-go, from getting the diagnosis, stress enters your life with the diagnosis. And then it becomes key to you learning how to master your stress and overcome it and have strategies in place. So that taps into things like your self-efficacy, your resilience, and the importance of the good coping strategies that are highlighted, your problem-based problem-focused coping, which is so key to your well-being. So be aware of stress. It's a little bit is good, but too much is very bad.
Okay, a question from our audience from Facebook Live. Somebody has asked they would like to have a better look at the resilience questionnaire. Where can they get access to it?
Yes, so I don't know whether my slides will be available as part of this webinar. And in fact, when we go back to the resilience questionnaire, I give you the reference. So the reference is out there in a publication. If you have any difficulty getting that, let MS Canada know, because I can forward the publication on to Shauna and colleagues at the Society, and they can make it available to you.
Okay. Somebody is wondering about the defunding in the US for MS research, and is that affecting studies internationally or in Canada specifically?
Great question. So, we are so intricately linked to the United States on so many levels, and that's, of course, relevant to research. I mean, MS Canada has very close links with the equivalent body in the United States, the National MS Society. There are many Canadian researchers who get grant money from the United States. I have had grants from the Progressive MS Alliance, which is based in the United States, although Canada is a very important player in that alliance. So last week, I was at the American Neuropsychiatry Association meeting in Montreal. Very significant. The first time the Americans have come to Canada for their neuropsychiatry conference. It's very telling, isn't it, given what's going on politically?
Yeah.
And, as an opportunity, I was asked to put together the MS symposium as part of that meeting. And because I collaborate so closely with MS colleagues, I invited a colleague up from Buffalo to come, give his presentation. And he's an acknowledged expert in cognition. And it's a real concern. And the Americans are very, very anxious about their funding. Their research depends on government funding. And if the funding is cut in a substantial way, it will have a devastating effect on the research landscape in the United States. It will also affect Canadians because, as I say, Canadians have grants from the United States. There's always been such a good collegial reciprocal relationship between the two MS bodies. And so what we're seeing in the United States, I think, is very distressing on many levels. I'll put the politics aside. But from a research perspective, it's very worrying. It's so easy to destroy research labs. It's so much harder to build them. And, once things are gone, there's a real worry, do they come back? And we all know that research advances through cumulative knowledge. In other words, whatever bits of information, useful information we gather from one research project informs the next bit of research. That's how we move the needle. That's how we advance. And so when you cut off that pipeline, it has the potential to set things back in a very significant way. And so, we're all looking at it with a sense of alarm and dismay, but with hope that somehow common sense and humanity prevails. But who knows whether it will. It's a worrying time, undoubtedly.
Time to move.
Isn't that appropriate? Mentioning climate change and environment, my lights
and the lights go out.
The lights I hope it's not a metaphor for the lights going off for research. That's my concern.
I hope so too. On to our next question. You answered this about internet-based cognitive behavioral therapy, but this person is wondering, there's such a shortage of CBT professionals. Could group sessions help?
Yes, excellent. Yes, and the answer is yes, absolutely. The CBT data works for individuals. It works for groups. And as the internet data shows, it can work online. The challenge with group CBT is that you want to have a group comprising individuals whose depression is roughly of similar severity. And of course, you can do that through screening. But yes, there's good, robust data that group psychotherapy can be very helpful for depression.
Okay, so another option for people. Next question, and I was kind of wondering this, but I didn't quite know how to word it, but this person does it quite well. How do MSers deal with family members who are not as resilient and would rather be ostriches with their heads in the sand? They add extra stress and anxiety. Tell me to leave them if they couldn't accept my MS, which is the wrong answer in this person's book. So how do you deal with those people who, as you said, have their heads in the sand?
Well, we go back to my slide on coping. I gave you the 3 well-described coping strategies, and the head in the sand is avoidance. And that's the worst coping strategy. By avoiding your disease, by avoiding, trying to avoid your symptoms, you will invariably make things worse. Things do not get better. And so, when people walk away from a problem, it can make that adaptation to multiple sclerosis very, very difficult. And then it's not just the patient who can suffer from it, but loved ones, caregivers, etc., can have a much greater burden of care in a situation like that. So avoidance is a bad coping strategy. Problem-focused coping is the way to go. And I gave you an example of that. I cite fatigue because fatigue is so common in the lives of people with multiple sclerosis. So there are multiple different strategies that you can look at to try and problem solve, to work your way around this problem. That's how you deal with a multiple sclerosis symptom. not by avoidance, not by putting your head in the sand.
Okay, I think her question was more about how do you deal with family members or friends who would rather be the ostriches than the person with
Oh,
MS.
same principle.
But
Avoidance over there is the same thing. That's not going to do anybody a favor. It's certainly not going to be the person with MS. We're not certainly not do them any favors at all by avoiding what the issues are. Um, you've really got to look the condition in the eye, directly in the eye, and deal with it. And that's why I wrote my book, to try and educate people that the symptoms that I've spoken about today, the silent symptoms of multiple sclerosis, the things that you can't see, are absolutely crucial to the well-being of someone with multiple sclerosis. So family members have to know that. And I can't tell you how many times a patient says to me, my family don't get it. I might look well because I'm walking okay, but that doesn't say anything about my cognition. It doesn't say anything about my fatigue or my mood or my pain. And so, if someone, a family member, sees a person looking well, they say, well, what's your problem? Yeah, you've got MS, but you look great. Well, no, there's much more to the equation than just looking great. What's your mood like? What are your anxiety levels like? What's your cognition like? Do you have pain? How bad is your fatigue? So those are the kind of things that are absolutely crucial that need to be addressed. And if family members don't see it in you because they can't see it, they might think it's not there. And so, what's the big deal? Why can't you come out? Why can't you go to parties? Why can't you, et cetera, et cetera? And that becomes a huge stress for the patient, for the person with multiple sclerosis. And so good management is not just looking after the person with MS, but also educating family members about this disease. They need to read about it. MS Canada's got a great website where people become informed about the silent symptoms of multiple sclerosis. So education becomes key to this process. Education is key to managing multiple sclerosis and key to family members understanding this complex disease.
okay, we've got a question here. I'm going to leave you with this question and run and get the cord for my laptop because I'm running out of juice here. But I'll let you answer the question while I'm gone just for a moment. Considering your extensive research involving neuroimaging in MS patients, how have recent advancements in MRI technology enhanced our understanding of the relationship between brain structural changes and neuropsychiatric symptoms in MS?
Fantastic question. I was hoping someone would ask that. Yes, so I've done a number of studies, and colleagues of mine have taken up this work, and this was work that was funded by MS Canada as well. We've shown very clearly that depression is linked to certain structural changes in the brain that is part of multiple sclerosis, certain key areas. And that's now being complemented by functional brain imaging. So, MRI, there are two kinds of MRI. There's a structural MRI that shows you the anatomy, and there's the functional MRI that shows you the function. So in terms of the structural changes, we know now that if there are problems in areas of the brain like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, the amygdala, the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, if there are structural abnormalities there, that individual is more at risk for developing depression. And why is that important? Well, it's very important for the following reason. I will have a patient who comes to see me who's depressed. And, I take a detailed history, and the patient says, doc, I'm depressed, but I'm still walking well. I've still got a job. My finances are okay. My marriage is good. My kids are healthy. But why am I depressed? My MS is under good control with the disease-modifying drug. Why am I depressed? And in those patients, the depression, I believe, can be directly linked, potentially, to the structural and functional brain changes that come with multiple sclerosis. So MS depression is a core symptom of multiple sclerosis. Yes, people can come depressed because they've lost their job. They've have difficulties with relationships. They can't walk the way they did. They had to give up a sport that they loved. Absolutely. Those are very significant stressors that can be linked to depression. But there's data to show that in the absence of these stressors, people can still become depressed because in some people, depression is a symptom of what's going on in your brain. And it's probably true for all depression, but it's just shown very clearly in individuals who don't have a stressful life, whose MS is well controlled but who have structural changes in the brain that might be triggering the depression. So that's a key observation. And there's very eloquent work that's coming out of other labs now showing that dysfunctional white matter tracts, for example, is linked to depression in people with multiple sclerosis. And then you've got this really fascinating functional brain imaging literature showing that when connections break down between the hippocampus and the amygdala on the one hand and aspects of the prefrontal cortex on the other, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, when those connections become faulty, those individuals are also more at risk for depression. So neuroscience is giving us lots of key insights into why rates of depression are so high in people with multiple sclerosis.
And it's also why we have to continue our studies and with imaging.
Correct, absolutely, because we're only just beginning. As technology becomes more and more sophisticated, so our advance in knowledge becomes exponential. It's interesting. When I did my PhD in England in 1992, it involved an MRI component looking to see whether we could find links between brain MRI changes and depression, and we couldn't. It was a negative study. But the MRI machine that I did my PhD on had a field strength of 0.15 Tesla. The MRI machines that we use routinely now have a field strength of 3 Tesla. So much more powerful. And in fact, if you're lucky enough to work in a neuroscience center like Sunnybrook, there's a 7 Tesla machine. So the moment the MRI technology became more sophisticated, the moment you could see the brain with a greater clarity, that's when we started to find the link between anatomical changes in the brain and depression. So technology is key to driving the bus over here. Technology is giving us some really important clues as to why depression is so common in the lives of people with multiple sclerosis.
Dr. Feinstein, I could talk to you for hours about all of this, and I'm sure most of our audience could sit and listen to you speak as well, but we are almost out of time, so I'm going to thank you for your presentation, and thank you for being with us this evening.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation. It's been a real pleasure.
And as we wrap up today's broadcast, we want to remind you about how you can connect with the MS Knowledge Network, which is staffed by trained navigators who provide consistent, quality information and support. You can connect by phone, by email, or live chat through the MS Canada website. Navigators are available Monday to Friday from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Eastern Time and can provide assistance in both English and French. And we'd like you to be a part of the MS community and encourage you to get involved with our programs, our services, events, government relations, and volunteer opportunities. Together, we can take action to create a future free of MS. To find out how you can take action, check out our website at mscanada.ca. If you have questions about any of our education activities, please reach out to the education team by email to education@mscanada.ca. On behalf of MS Canada, thank you for tuning in for today's webinar. Good night.